touch on kneading and wedging in a little bit because today you can buy prepared clay ready to use. Prepared clay gives big advantages because you have even levels of moisture but also no air bubbles. I often use a wire to cut through clay, then I have sections that are easier to work with. As you can see with the prepared clay, the consistency is smooth and there are no bubbles. The reason you want to avoid air bubbles is because when you go to fire the piece, the surface could flake off, or in extreme cases, the piece could explode or crack. Whenever you're done working with clay, you want to make sure that the bag is sealed so that pieces don't dry out. As you're working on pieces, you want to keep your scraps of clay moist so that you can eventually blend them together. You blend the clay into an even moist consistency by kneading and wedging. The kneading of clay is very similar to the kneading of bread, where you're blending ingredients. You knead clay with the palms of your hands by pressing down and spreading outward. Kneading is mixing and blending the clay, while wedging is driving out any air bubbles. Wedging is a very simple process of cutting a piece of clay in half and then slamming one part down on top of the other one. You can see some small air bubbles, but as we work with the clay, it'll smooth and these will disappear. Slam the clay down hard. After we've done the wedging a few times, you can see that we now have a smooth piece of clay and no holes or air bubbles. The best way to roll out your clay is with a rolling pin, and I prefer those made from wood. Most of the raku that we're going to be doing in our lessons will be made from slabs that we've rolled out. Just like kneading, rolling out clay is very similar to working with dough. You want your clay soft enough so that it'll roll without cracking, yet still not stick to the rolling pin. And you want to maintain an even thickness. In addition to rolling out slabs, you can also make pieces either from coils or by throwing on a wheel. I usually roll clay out on an old sheet or a piece of muslin. However, you can use things like burlap or other textured materials. You don't really want to use a hard surface like a tile because the clay will stick. You would want to roll your clay out so that it's roughly 1/4 of an inch thick. As you can see, it's pretty much the same thickness throughout. On some sculptural pieces you may go up to 1/2 inch thick, but in that case you would need the sculpture clays. While designing pieces, we have shape, color, and texture to work with. I'm going to start with texture because that can be applied either before we construct a piece or after. Adding texture can be done with very simple tools, even a stick from your backyard. You can use items to press designs into the clay, or you can roll the clay out on surfaces that have texture already in it. We'll proceed through a variety of tools as you watch. As you work with clay, you'll have 3 stages that are based on moisture content. First is the plastic or pliable stage, where the clay has a lot of moisture content and is easy to shape without any cracking. You can bend it, you can roll coils and slabs and do pretty much anything you wish with the clay as far as shaping and forming. The next stage is the leather hard stage. This is when the clay is still damp, but it's dried out too much to be bent or shaped without cracking. Leather hard stage is when you can put pieces together, also seal edges, and make things like boxes. When clay is completely dried out, that's what we call bone hard. At this stage, there is no more actual construction that can be done. Pieces could not be sealed together without extreme cracking. This is when your piece is actually ready to do the bisque firing. Our first project will be with slab building, and we're going to make a plate. Begin by rolling out our slab of clay to 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little thicker. You can use a common dinner plate for a pattern. I use a pointed tip table knife to cut the clay. Between drying and firing, you'll get about 10 to 15% shrinkage, so it's best to cut larger than the size of the plate. As part of my design, I'm going to tear the clay partway down the body of the plate and then fasten it back together. To put the edges together so they stay, I'm going to wet them and then score them well. After pressing the sides together, I then go to the back side and smooth the edges so that they become one piece. Because raku is very porous and the surfaces are often more matted or dried, it is not a good medium to make things like teapots or coffee cups or any kind of an item that's truly functional. Its best use is either for the traditional tea services or to make things like plates and bowls, possibly jars, little containers, and also a wide range of sculptural items. I cover the plate mold with a sheet of paper to avoid sticking and then put the slab of clay on so that I can get the concave shape. As you can see, I leave the edges rough in certain areas just for contrast of texture. When we're done, we have a really interesting piece. You can use anything that's handy for a pattern. We'll make another larger plate, but this time we'll texture the edges. To get my pattern, I'm using the handle of a fork. When the piece is glazed, I'll stain the indentations so they stand out better. We can also build up the surface of the piece. As we did with an earlier plate, we need to score both sections that we are putting together and wet them so that they adhere well. It's probably more effective design-wise to do a build-up in a small area and leave the rest of the plate as a contrast and maybe enhance it with some glazing. A very good way to get texture on the surface of your clay is to roll it out on fabrics. We'll start off by using a piece of scrap curtain. We can lift the clay and the fabric all in one motion into the mold or the form that we're using for our bowl. The fabric is supporting the clay so that it doesn't tear easily and it can be bent and shaped into place. Once we get our initial form, we can trim the top and smooth the edges. If there are areas with too much variation in thickness, we can add extra clay and just keep smoothing until we get a good strong form. For this bowl, we're going to place a coil on the upper rim for support, but also for decoration. In order to secure the coil to the rim of the bowl, we're going to want to wet the surface and then score it. We also need to wet the coil and then score it. Anytime we are attaching surfaces, this is how you want to do it, is by wetting them both well and then scoring them and then putting them together. Scoring both surfaces before we put them together gives us a good, tight, secure bond. We can press the two surfaces together, and that'll also secure our bond. Depending on the look that you're after, you might smooth the entire piece, but you also might leave the coil, or you might leave spaced out finger designs. With this bowl, we're going to smooth the inside, but let the coil show from the outside. Once we have most of the shape done, we can then put the bowl aside and let it dry to the leather hard stage. Once the bowl is leather hard, it's much easier to handle it and it'll retain its shape. We're going to put a little base on the pot. In pottery, this is called a foot, and we're going to do this with a coil. In the same process that we did with the rim, we wet it and score it and then fasten it together. Texture on this plate was achieved by rolling the clay out over a burlap bag and using the seam. One of the oldest methods of forming pottery is to take a ball of clay and pinching it into shape. The pinching is literally putting your finger into the ball of clay and then pressing between your thumb and index finger. As you practice this method, you'll eventually be able to feel the thickness of the walls of the pot as you work, so that everything's nice and even. As you can see, the walls are about 1/4 of an inch thick, maybe a little less. In this section, you'll learn how to join 3 slabs as we make a tea bowl. The tea bowl is about half the height of your finger. The main thing you want to do is to score any edges you're going to be putting together, just like we did with the coils. Another method that is very good to help secure 2 pieces together is to not only score your edges, but to make a slurry and apply that between them. A slurry is made by taking pieces of bone-dry clay and putting them in a little bit of water. You want to use bone-dry clay because if it's only leather hard, it won't absorb the water as readily. The slurry is also a good filler as you smooth your seams. The 3 pieces of our tea bowl are the sides, the bottom, and the foot. In many pieces that you make, it's often best to show the process that you followed as you made the piece. In other words, letting some seam show, letting some of the roughness of the surface show. Another very old method of making pottery is by what's called coil building. We'll do a few coils in this how-to so that you can see a little bit more how it's done. But keep in mind that even though we're only going to be doing maybe a few coils high, you could build pots that were 100 layers of coils high. The most important thing while coil building is to use clay that hasn't dried out very much, that's very plastic and pliable. A good way to tell if it's appropriate, is to roll a small coil and try curving it or bending it. If there's any cracking, then you need to get the clay more moist. To burnish, you take something smooth, like a stick or a stone. In this case, we're using a river stone, making sure that it's very smooth. And then we rub the pottery in a circular motion. When we do this, we need to make sure that our pottery is in the leather hard stage. Burnishing is a way of finishing pottery. It's often done when there's no glaze available. You can see examples of burnished pots in southwestern pottery, but also in a lot of African pottery or Mediterranean pottery. You can see how burnishing makes the surface shiny, gives it a sheen. This is because the particles have been condensed and the surface hardened by rubbing. I often make molds of items that I want to put on the surface of my pots. On your original form, you'll want to make sure that there are no areas that are undercut or that will block pulling the mold away from the original piece. Making a mold is really quite simple and just a matter of letting your original dry to a bone hard stage or firing it in a bisque firing and then pressing moist clay onto the surface. This gives you a negative which you can in turn let dry on bisque fire and then press moist clay into to give you a duplicate of your original shape. After you've finished constructing your piece, you should sponge off any sharp edges or pieces that might flake off during the firing process. You should also make sure that your bottom is smooth so that there isn't any scratching on any tabletops. You can also do some final touch-up after you've done the bisque firing of the piece with some emery cloth, maybe like a 600 grit or a little bit lower. With most pottery, there are two firing cycles. The first being bisque, which is a soft firing, an initial firing that is done prior to putting on glazes. The bisque firing is done very slowly. First, it's fired so that you're driving out all of the moisture from the bone dry clay, and then hardens the more it's fired and as the crystalline structure melts together. Your goal in the bisque firing is to have pottery that is solid and hard and durable, but still porous enough to withstand the shock of the glaze process. A bisque firing might take 5-6 hours to do as you proceed from your low temperatures on up to say 1800 degrees, while the finished glaze process firing might only last 15 minutes. Glazes are mixes of substances that when fired turn into a glass. They're applied to the surface of the pot for either decorative purposes or to seal the pot. In raku, their main effect is for decoration. We take our pre-made glaze and add some water so that we have a consistency that is very similar to a thick cream. The number of coats that we put on really depends on the properties of the glaze and the amount of color that you want to achieve. In most cases, one coat will give you a stained look, 2 coats starts to develop the copper colors and the brighter metallic colors, and then 3 coats you might start getting some running and more of a fluid glaze. We use a soft brush and just apply the glaze to the bisqued pottery. You can buy glazes prepared from a pottery shop, or you can make your own. For most uses in this how-to, we're going to use pre-made glazes from shops. However, we will also cover a little bit on making your own and give you some recipes. It's often good to have a couple of different glazes to work with on one piece so that you get more variety after it's fired. The exciting colors they develop during the raku firing process are the result of oxides or metallic substances that are put within the glaze, and they're usually in high saturation levels. One of the main of these is copper carbonate. The copper carbonate is what gives you the bright metallic copperish colors, as well as many reds, but also greens. If you are using low concentrations of copper carbonate and firing in the proper atmosphere, you would get more greens. However, in raku, we fire in what's called a reduction atmosphere, which simply means that the oxygen content of the air during the firing is reduced and replaced by carbon. The carbon content, or reduction atmosphere, is the result of burning organic materials. A reduction firing can either be done in the initial firing of the pot, or we can introduce it into an atmosphere after we take it out of the kiln. One of the things that is fun about raku, and the most interesting, is that the final colors that you achieve are affected in such a way that they are completely unpredictable. Or if not completely unpredictable, at least a big surprise when we finally see them. This round vase was made with a very rough surface. I fired it and then stained the bisque. The stain was a wash of red iron oxide mixed with water. Over this stained surface, I'll now brush on some glazes and use different thicknesses depending on the section of the pot. Usually what I'll try to do is put the thinnest wash over the entire piece and then almost dry brush other layers of glaze on raised surface areas of the pot. When you are decorating your piece, remember that any unglazed areas or raw clay areas are probably going to fire as black or charcoal in the reduction atmosphere. Even if the clay is white or red, it's most likely going to turn black, or like I said, a charcoal or a gray color. This is another example on a textured piece of highlighting the upper part of the surface. With a small tea bowl, we're going to coat the foot and the lower part of the body of the piece with a typical raku glaze that might develop some metallics or some sheens. However, that's going to be rougher. So we're going to do the lip and the interior of the piece in a smooth gloss crackle white glaze. A very interesting technique is to use something that will resist a glaze, like a wax that will cause the glaze to split from the surface or bead. And this will give areas that have no glaze and areas that do have glaze once it's coated. There are a lot of things that you can use as a resist. Car wax works well, so does paraffin wax. You can use latex. In this case, I'm using a product called Mod Podge. Simply paint your design, set the piece aside so it dries, and then apply your glaze over the surface of that. In areas that do not fully resist the glaze, you'll see that parts that are touching the bisque pot will dry quite fast, but those on the resist area will not dry as quickly. Because of this, you could take a sponge or a rag and carefully wipe off the areas that you want the glaze removed from. We're going to go through two easy ways to make your own kiln. The one I recommend the most is to find some old burned out electric kilns. I found two for about $25 a piece. One was a 3-piece kiln and the other one was a single piece. For my kiln I ended up with 3 sections. I used the lids and the original flooring for the old kilns as the flooring and the base for my new kiln. For my lid I used a garbage can lid lined with kale wool. Kale wool is a high heat resistant material in blanket form that you can find at pottery shops. In the lid you'll want to cut a vent hole or a flue hole of about 5.5 inches. Your flue hole should always be a little bit bigger than your burner port. The burner port for this kiln will be about 4 inches. There are a number of different burners that can be used for a kiln. For this design we're going to use a simple weed burner that can be bought at a hardware store. All things considered, this might be the best design of all and surpass the Venturi style burners because we're going to be introducing air to raise our firing temperature quickly. A weed burner also has advantages because you don't have to worry about pressure gauges and various settings. With the shaft design of the weed burner, it's very easy to position it properly in the burner port. The burner should be placed at an angle. The weed burner is then hooked up to a propane tank like that used for a barbecue. When we line the kiln lid, or for that matter an entire kiln, with kale wool, it's easy to do if we make some slab buttons. The buttons are placed facing the kiln chamber and held in place by heat-resistant wire called nichrome. If we build our kiln from old ceramic kilns, we have the advantage that they are lined with fire brick. When we buy an old kiln, we really don't care if any of the electronics or internal wiring is good, just so the fire brick is not too badly damaged. If we do have some broken or damaged bricks, we can stuff in kale wool as kind of a filler. If you're lucky enough to find 2 kilns, you can use some of the extra brick for repairs or for things like shelf supports or flame deflectors. Some people use kiln shelves to support the pottery that's inside. However, I use barbecue grill grates. I have found that the temperature in the kiln and the length of time of the firing is not so much that the grill grates won't last quite a long time compared to the short life of ceramic kiln shelves. Depending on the type of kiln that you design or the parts that you find, you could use a skin that is 1 piece, or for that matter you could even use something like a garbage can. Instead of fire brick, you could line this with kale wool sheets just like we did the lid. The key to reaching glaze temperatures quickly with this style of kiln is by the use of forced air. We place the air source or hose so that it's blowing into the back of the burner. The more oxygen or air that you can introduce into the kiln chamber, the hotter it'll fire. You can tape or wire the hose to the burner shaft or find something as an enclosure to hold it together, like I'm using this cement block. For our air source, we're using a shop vac with the hose attached so the air is blowing out rather than sucking in. A good safety accessory to have standing by is a water hose. I highly recommend using a pyrometer to check the temperature of the interior of the kiln as it fires. The lead for the pyrometer should be placed midway or in the upper half of the kiln and can enter through a hole that you've drilled or maybe an old peephole. As you watch the firing process, it'll become much clearer how the kiln is used and why we have built certain things the way we have. I prefer to build a small fire inside the kiln before I turn the gas on and ignite the burner. This kiln we can reach 1850 degrees in about 15 to 20 minutes, depending on how heavy of a load we have and how hot the kiln is when we start. You'll want some good leather gloves to protect your hands and a pair of fireplace tongs. You should wear cotton clothing and not polyester or nylon that can melt if something hot touches it. Over time, in many firings, the grate may slump. You can just flip it over and it'll go back in shape. Use the tongs to place everything in the kiln. You can put quite a bit into each load. If the items are not glazed, they can touch each other. If they are glazed, just leave a tiny space in between. Take your time and don't rush as you position things. When you finish packing the kiln, pick up the lid with the tongs and put it in place. You'll find an advantage with the garbage can lid and kale roll is that it's very light. Don't plug up your flue hole, leave it open so that you have good airflow. I usually turn up the gas flow slowly at first and then build up to about 1200 degrees over, say, 20 minutes to a half hour. About half that time your gas valve will be open completely. At 1200 degrees, I turn on the shop vac and increase the airflow. At this point, the temperature rises very rapidly and will reach about 1850 degrees in 10 to 15 minutes. At 1850, or whatever temperature your glazed material's at, you can open the kiln lid. You can reach inside with your tongs and remove the piece you're working on. It is now time for us to introduce our work into a reduction atmosphere. We do this by moving to a kettle or another type of a container that might be filled with combustible material like leaves, sawdust, or paper. Placing our pot into the combustible material is going to cause smoke, which is the vehicle that adds carbon to the atmosphere that surrounds our pot. The reaction of the carbon with metals that are in our glaze is what gives us the bright colors and the metallics that are the signature of raku pottery. Most of the time I seal the container so that the smoke is captured inside and reacts with the surface of the pot for a half an hour up to an hour. You can watch as we fire some different loads.